Hello, today I'm going to show you how to get Visual Studio 2015 ready for Android application development using Xamarin. Now, it's important that when you install Visual Studio that you make sure and check cross-platform mobile development. It's very important that you have this checked. This is all the tools, this is Xamarin, this is everything that you need to compile and run your mobile applications. Now, it's also very important that you have at least Community Edition. Enterprise is fine, as you can see that's what I'm using here. You just can't use Express. You'll be missing some things that you'll need. Now over here I've got it started up, and once you've installed it and you've got it running, the first thing that you want to go to is Tools. Now under Tools you want to go over to Android, and under Android you want to go to the Android SDK Manager. It's very important that you do this first before you try compiling or running any mobile applications for Android. Reason being is when you install Xamarin, it may not necessarily capture everything it needs. It's always a good idea to go in here and make sure that you have all the tools that you need for Android development. Now you'll see here that you've got some basic tools at the top, but then you've got a section of tools for every version of Android going back all the way to 2.1, API version 7. Now, you really only need to go backwards 5 versions, back to 19. You don't have to go back that far, but if you plan on marketing your applications, you want to make sure that your app will work on the largest number of phones that's out there. And most manufacturers support phones that can handle an operating system about 5 versions backwards compatible. So you want to grab at minimum 24, 23, and 22. But it'd be a good idea to go as far back as 19, but you shouldn't need to go back any farther than that. This quick, you also want to make sure that you get the latest version of Android SDK tools and Android SDK platform tools. These are various debugging and other useful things that you'll need with your emulator and compile time debugging and so on. One last thing that you want to make sure that you have if you have an Intel processor. Now I have it installed for demonstration purposes, but if you don't have an Intel processor, then this won't do you any good. But if you do, on your machine that you're running here, it is very important that you get this because it will make your emulator run much smoother, much faster. Unfortunately, if you're running AMD, this won't help you. Also, I want to point out that when you first run this, it will download the Intel x86 emulator accelerator. It will not install it. But don't worry, you don't have to go hunting for it. Just when it finishes its first run through, and it's always a good idea to do this anyways because it may have missed some pieces of other stuff, that once you're finished, you can either close out the Android SDK Manager and go back in, or you can go up here to Packages and hit Reload. And it will run through the check one more time, and it will try and tell you what it thinks that you should get. The second time around, you'll have the option to install what you previously downloaded here. Now once you're finished, you just go ahead and close out of this, and we'll move on to the next step. Now once you've finished with the Android SDK Manager, and you've made sure that you've downloaded everything that you need from as far as Android SDK and various tools go, is you want to go back again to Tools, Android, and this time you want to go to Android Emulator Manager. And it's from here, this is where you create your virtual devices. This is where you create the virtual machine that will run your Android applications. This is a virtual Android phone, virtual device. Now I already have one pre-created here, and you may have some pre-existing in there that come by default. I would suggest you just go ahead and delete those. You can walk through and create your own. It's easier to start from scratch than try and fiddle with one that's already been set to the defaults. And I emphasize that you're going to fiddle with this, as every system is different. Some things that I got to work smoothly on mine may not necessarily work very smoothly on yours. These virtual machines are very hardware dependent, As for example, I am running an AMD processor in this computer, and so I'm having to use one of the ARM CPUs, and I can't use an Intel one. More on that later. So first you want to go to Create. Of course, the first thing you have to do is give it a name, so we'll give it Tutorial. And the next thing you want to choose the device. This is the real-world device that this is going to emulate. Now, for your first beginner applications, and even most basic applications you're going to make, it doesn't really matter which device you choose, just so long as it's a relatively recent one. And if you're concerned about smaller screens, then of course choose one with a smaller screen so you can see what it looks like. For this, I'm just going to choose Nexus 6. Next, and it automatically chooses a target, but it's in alphabetical order, or in this case numeric order, so it's almost never going to choose the one that you actually want to choose, which is the latest one, API level 24. This is the operating system that's running on here. And the reason you want to choose the latest one is because you want to make sure that you have the full features. You know, if someone has the latest phone, they get the greatest that your app can offer. You also want to test that it still works on older versions, but your primary virtual machine should be the latest version, or at least the target version that you plan on supporting. Next, you need to choose what kind of processor this will pretend to have. Now, again, Intel Atoms, these are the best ones here. Very smooth emulators, but you can only use it if you have an Intel processor. It requires some chipset drivers, requires an Intel processor to integrate with. I do not, so I can't choose these. So I'm going to go with the same one that I picked in the other one, and that would be API ARM ARM64. Now next is your skin. This is a wraparound of your virtual machine's screen. It can add a full keyboard support, all the little extra buttons that may be on various phones, so you can play around with functionality with that. As a basic virtual device, I tend to choose no skin. This way it looks like most phones, to where it's just the screen with the 3 buttons on the bottom. You can give it additional commands like holding on the power button. That's easy enough. No skin also tends to work the best, in my experience. Some final things that you want to make sure and set correctly is your RAM. Now, I have 8 gigs of RAM on this machine, so I've got it set to about 3 gigs there. This is up to you. The more gigs the more RAM you give it, the better it will respond. The sooner it will boot up, the less you'll have to worry about losing frames or bad performance because of the virtual device that may mask issues that you have with your actual application. However, this reserves that RAM from your system memory. So regardless of whether or not your phone is actually using all of the RAM that you've given it, it is preventing the rest of your computer from using that memory. So just keep that in mind. VM heap, it's usually a good idea to just leave this as default. If you're doing a lot of heavy processing with your application, you may want to increase this, but the default of 32 is usually good enough. That's the last thing you really need to check. The rest of this is pretty self-explanatory. If you wish to mess with that, it's, like I said, self-explanatory. Just hit OK, and it'll run for a few moments. It's building all the hardware behind the scenes, and you'll get a little report like this of all of the little pieces and components that's in your virtual device and what they're set to. Also, any checks that it did to make sure that it was created correctly. You don't have to worry too much about this. If there was an actual error, it would pop up on top of this saying what went wrong. So you can just go ahead and hit OK, and we'll get on to the next step. Now that you've created your virtual device, you want to first start it. It has to be running for you to run any applications on it. So make sure and click on it, and then just go over here and click on Start. Now, the launch options. This is where you can control how it appears on your computer. You can set the display size to the actual size of the phone, but if you're wanting to see more granular detail, You just want it to take up more space so you can make sure that everything is fitting nicely, and you can blow it up. You can just leave it as it is and just hit launch. But if you want to make sure that it's still visible while it will be on an actual phone, you just hit scale display to real size. But for now, I'm just going to leave it as default and hit launch. Go ahead and start your Android emulator. Now, this is any runtime errors that it may have or status reports. You can see a little bit of info there, but obviously it is running because now I've got my window. I'm going to give this a few moments to boot up, and we'll continue from there. Okay, now it's booted up, and we're ready to rock and roll with my own virtual Android phone. Now, it can take a good 5 minutes or so to boot up the first time, but the good news is, unless you're building an app that deals with what happens when the phone boots up, once you have it up and running, that's it. You don't have to restart it or anything. You can just leave it be. Because I'm recording, this is kind of slow, and I'm going to get errors here, such and such not responding, but that's all fine. So once you've got your emulator up and running, you want to go ahead and just close this little report window. You don't need the virtual device manager. You can close out of that. And you just want to leave this up and running. And let's go to a simple blank application. Now, the way that you make this, just go to File, New Project. And you want to go down to, of course, under Visual C#. And underneath that, you'll find Android. And it's the first option, blank app. Now, I've already got one saved here. And I haven't done anything to this. This is straight out the box. And once it's loaded in, all you have to do is go up here, and you should see the name of your virtual device here. Now, sometimes it doesn't immediately load in the name of your virtual device, or it may say just emulator dash and then the port that it's on, like 5554 for example. Don't worry, that's still pointing to the same emulator. Now again, this is going to take a little while the first time that you do this, because when you're telling it to run, it's not like a regular C# app to where it just immediately runs. You haven't packaged it or anything. This actually compiles it, packages it, and then deploys it onto your virtual device. Then once it's on there, it runs. Now, I've found that most of the time, the first time that you do this, it may not run automatically on your virtual device. But you want to look right down here in the lower left-hand corner. It says deploying to test, in my case, the name of the emulator. That's where you'll pay attention to see once it has said ready or the bar turns orange, one of the two, you should be able to find the app on your phone. Now, sometimes it's not quite there yet with ready. You may want to wait until it turns orange, but as you can see here, there it is. Just go ahead and click on it to start it up. And again, because I'm recording, this is a little bit slower. It takes up some RAM for that to work. Let's wait for this to finish booting up. And now the default blank app, all it is just a title bar here, and in a few moments we should see a button beneath that that says Hello World. Let's just wait a few moments and I'll resume once it's ready. And here we go. There's the button. It just increments with every time you click, tell you how many times you clicked on it. It's just a real basic blank app. Now, like I said before, you may see debugging, it may turn orange, and your IDE will change the first time that you run it through. But even though that stops, your app is still available on your Android virtual device. You can just go in and run it just like you would on a regular phone. And that concludes the intro to Android development on Visual Studio using Xamarin. This is all that you need to get started. Take it easy.